Here in the attic is the place where heaven meets the earth. Our guests experience God in supernatural and amazing ways. My guest in the attic today is Mr. Artur Pawlawski, the founder of the Canadian Street Church. Known as a street advocate in his country, Mr. Pawlawski fights for the freedom of the gospel in the country that should theoretically be an example of such freedom. He has become famous in Poland because of the idea of starting the March for Jesus. Welcome, Arthur. You're a Pole living in Canada. Before you settled in Canada, you lived in Greece. Why did you immigrate to Canada? From the very beginning, while I was still very young, I was involved in various types of business. I traveled around Europe, smuggling things, buying and selling gold and alcohol from Russia, through the Czech Republic, Hungary, Germany, you name it.
Cały czas biznes, handel. W wieku 16-17 lat byłem prywatnym
At the age of 16, I was a private banker. I was walking around with a weapon, and at the age of 17, I decided to smuggle a large number of weapons from the former Soviet Union, but my dad decided to immigrate to Greece. At that time, he was already in Greece and wanted the entire family to join him.
Zaczął się następny biznes w Grecji, zaczął budować domy dla...
My dad started another business in Greece. He built houses for the richest and most famous people while employing illegal immigrants. We built in national parks, so we had to give bribes. It was a corrupt world, but we had a nice business, meaning our business looked good and nobody knew what it was really like.
W 1992 roku poznałem swoją przyszłą żonę.
In 1992, I met my future wife, who loved God and was a newly converted Christian. But after many negative experiences, I hated people at that time. I did not want to have anything to do with people other than maintaining business relations. She paid a very high price for engaging in a relationship with me. She was going to church and you did not want to go. She was telling you about God, and you? I would say that the church was mafia, worse than the one I was working with. She said that God loved me, but I could not see it. What about the children dying in Africa, or people dying from cancer? Where is God? What God? Who are we actually talking about?
In
1995, we had an opportunity to immigrate to Canada, so we moved our business to Calgary. And this was the beginning of a real nightmare for my wife, because she loved God and wanted to go to church, but I was avoiding him in every possible way. I didn't buy her a jacket because I was incredibly jealous, and I didn't want her to leave the house. The temperatures in Calgary reach -30 and 40 degrees centigrade. I didn't let her get a driver's license because I didn't want her to drive. She often asked me to drive her to church, and I would ask her the question, "Do you love God?" She would respond, "Yes." And I would say, "The door's over there. You can walk to church." So my wife for many months walked to church without a jacket while it was -30 outside. Years later, she told me that at times it was so cold that she almost froze and needed to run in order not to freeze.
Kiedy tak szłam pieszo do kościoła, to
When I walked to church while it was -30 or 40 degrees centigrade, or sometimes more, I had very mixed feelings. I knew that Satan would do everything he possibly could to make me hate my husband. But looking through the eyes of God's love, I knew that this was a spiritual battle. Nevertheless, at times you accompanied your wife to church. And one day a prophet from Poland, Richard Krzywy, came to church. He said something to you that shook you up badly.
Zacząłem zarabiać bardzo dobre pieniądze, po $5000 dziennie już obrotów robiliśmy.
At that time, I started making really good money, $5,000 a day. Things were going well. We had big plans. All of a sudden, I became a jerk to my wife. I wanted a divorce, and I wanted to continue my business alone and do what I wanted to do. And it was right at that time that the prophet came. The prophet pointed at me during the church service without knowing who I was, and he said to me, "Because you are the way you are, because you're so arrogant and stuck up and treat people badly, I will take everything away from you. You will lose everything. You'll be looking for help, but you'll not find it anywhere." I laughed at him. I thought he was crazy. Actually, I always believed that Christians were fanatics who lived in a different world. But the word he gave you came to pass quickly.
W ciągu 3 miesięcy Bóg dotknął się mojej firmy w taki sposób, że
In 3 months, God touched my business in a way that I lost everything. Things were missing at every construction site. Some cement here, heavy equipment there, one thing or another. The clients stopped paying. Even the church did not pay me. These people were my good friends. They paid later, but it was too late. God stopped the flow of cash, which was detrimental to my business. He stopped it for 3 months. I was finished. I was totally bankrupt. This was the first heavy blow which brought me closer to my wife. She was the only person who understood me. And at the same time, I was working and praying to God, I think for the first time in my life. Help me out of my debt. Okay, I understand. I deserve it. But don't let me go to jail because I'd not been stealing. I did business, but I was not robbing anyone. And God helped me, because within just 6 months I paid off all of my debt. However, I had no money left.
Zostałeś zerem i co dalej?
Zrozumiałem, że
You had no money left? And then what? I understood that there was indeed someone powerful and mighty in the world. God really existed. The prophecy had come to pass so quickly that I started to think about my life. I got back together with my wife, and we decided to start all over in our relationship and to have a baby. Another prophet came and said to me that God would give me a wonderful gift. I knew that my wife was pregnant. God was speaking to us, and I was listening to the prophecies. I knew that the prophecies were real. By that time, I already knew that these prophets were not a bunch of druggies, but that they were real. I knew that these people were hearing a voice which I was not able to hear. My ears were open. My wife and I prayed. I was asking for God's grace. I didn't want to go back to where I was before. The prophet said that I would receive a wonderful gift from God. My wife and I knew that God was speaking about our child.
Musiałeś być w ciężkim szoku, kiedy okazało się...
You must have been in great shock when your wife's test results were not promising.
Nie, wyniki badań USG było super.
Natomiast potem...
No, the ultrasound test results were fine, but my son was born dead. He was not breathing, and his face was blue. There were no chances to save him. Doctors were rushing everywhere. My wife was in a state of panic. I'll never forget the look on her face.
Kiedy zobaczyłem, jak to dziecko wychodzi, nie rusza się, nie oddycha, to jest szok. To jest autentycznie szok, nie do opowiedzenia.
I saw my child not breathing, not moving. I cannot describe how shocked I was. At the time of the birth, there was no chance for survival, but my son was resuscitated. He was then transported to an intensive care unit in a specialist children's hospital. 3 doctors came to me and said that we need to consider discontinuing life support because medically, my son had no chances for survival. What was wrong with your son? He was born with a hole in his diaphragm, and through this hole, all his abdominal organs, such as intestines and stomach, squashed his lungs. He had no lung, and his heart was pushed to the other side. It was a total mess.
Moja żona powiedziała od razu nie. I zaczęła się...
Right away, my wife said no, and she started calling everyone she knew and the people from the church. They called others. They all came to the hospital. They prayed, declared, cried, and stood with us. But as for me, I did not participate. I was like a frozen man with no feelings. I pushed my emotions and feelings aside. I could not speak. I couldn't even talk to my wife. I was just standing and watching in shock. Then a period of rebellion came. I left the hospital and tried to get into my car, but I had locked my keys inside. I started kicking my car as hard as I could, and I started yelling at God, who in my mind was a liar. You promised me a great gift. You said that we would have a wonderful child, and my child is dying. You are a liar. My faith was so great that I didn't even think for a second that my God would cause my child to die.
Po prostu nie przyszło mi to do głowy nawet. Ja miałam taką wiarę, ja wiedziałam, gdzie pamiętam, gdzie straciłam dużo krwi, gdzie po porodzie nie mogłam ustać na własnych nogach, po prostu jakoś tam omdlewałam.
I lost a lot of blood during delivery, and I couldn't stand. I was fainting, but I told my husband to give me the phone to call the women of God in our church. My husband asked, "What for?" And I said, "What do you mean, what for? People must pray now." He didn't even think about this. My wife was organizing church meetings. Pastors and people were praying for my son. And I kept on saying, "What are you talking about? My God, this God you are talking about does not love. He took my money away from me, fine. But now he's touching my promised son. Who does he think he is?" There was no vein left in my son's body to hook up another IV. The child had medical equipment inside of him and had no chance of survival. Then something happened to me that I could not believe. I began to have a vision. It was like watching TV in front of my eyes. It wasn't my subconscious. I know it's difficult to believe, but it was real. I saw Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. I saw how he suffered and was sweating blood and crying, and how afraid he was. He knew full well what was waiting for him. He knew that this was a crucial moment for humanity. What did this vision mean to you? At that moment, this vision meant nothing to me. I was in shock. The vision continued, and I saw how they began to torture and beat Jesus in a brutal way, and his blood began to splash everywhere. I had a sense that this blood splashed on me as well, and I ran out of the hospital.
Na drugi dzień wróciłem z powrotem do szpitala, znowuż zastąpić swoją żonę. Ona poszła i w momencie, kiedy...
The next day I returned to the hospital and the vision continued. I saw how they took Jesus from one court to the next, and how he stood before Pontius Pilate. I don't know if we can imagine what a horrible pain it is when you have your flesh ripped off, as Jesus had his beard ripped off. It was so terrifying that I ran out of the hospital again. I went to work. Then day 3 began. I returned to the hospital. The vision continued.
Zaczęła się ona ponownie. Po raz trzeci. Zobaczyłem, jak targał ten krzyż na Golgotę. I chcę wam powiedzieć, że
I saw how Jesus was dragging his cross to Golgotha. I want to tell you that Jesus was crucified in a very public place. It was a busy intersection of different roads, and he was crucified naked.
Jego ciało było tak zdruzgotane i tak zniszczone.
His body was so disfigured that you could not tell whether it was male or female. It was macabre. It was brutal and horrific, and then darkness came. When Jesus gave up his spirit, an awful darkness covered the earth. It was not the type of darkness that we're used to, where you can see some light here and there. It was the kind of darkness where you could see absolutely nothing. The creator of heaven and earth had just died. He was murdered and killed. All creation began to weep because its creator had just died. I saw a leaf of grass crying. All the animals and all the trees were crying. God's entire creation was crying. The darkness then ended.
I ja stałem w szoku.
I was in shock.
Wróciło
The vision
to
ended.
pomieszczenie, w którym
I saw
byłem.
hospital beds
Hermetycznie
again.
białe,
Then
prześcierane,
I heard the
wszystko
voice of
było.
God in
Bóg
the same
powiedział do
way
mnie
I
tak,
can hear you
usłyszałem go, tak
now.
jak rozmawiam z
He
tobą.
said,
Powiedział,
"What
co
would
byś
you do
zrobił,
to
żeby
rescue your
uratować
son?"
twojego syna?
I answered,
Powiedziałem
"I will do
wszystko, każdy
anything.
zabieg.
Tell me to kill and I will do
Wybiję
it.
pół
I
szpitala,
will kill half of the
żeby
hospital
tylko
if
mój syn
necessary to
żył.
rescue my son."
A co Bóg na to?
What did God say to this?
Bóg powiedział mi tak. Powiedział,
God said to me, "There's nothing you can do. You cannot rescue your son. I could have rescued my son, but do you know why I didn't do it?"
nie zrobiłem? I dał taką pauzę. I ta pauza była potrzebna, bo
He then
ja
paused.
zacząłem sobie zdawać
I
sprawę,
needed
że
this this
to, co się
pause to
dzieje, jest
realize that
tak
what was happening was
ponadnaturalne.
supernatural,
Zaczęło
and it
to
all
klikać
began to
wszystko w
click in
moim
my
błędnym
head
myśle i
and my
sercu.
heart.
I powiedział tak,
God then
dla
said,
ciebie.
"For you
I dla
and
wszystkich
for all
innych
other
ludzi.
people."
I zobaczyłem
Then I
dwa
saw two hearts
serca
of
dwóch
two
ojców.
fathers.
Razem byliśmy
Both I
ojcami.
and God
Tak,
were
Bóg,
fathers.
który stworzył
God
nas,
who created
i
us,
ja,
and me
z
with a
dzieckiem, które
child
nie ma
who had
szansy
no
na
chance of
życie. Dwóch
survival.
ojców, ale jeden ojciec
However, we were
chciał,
different
żeby inna
fathers.
matka płakała.
I was a father who wanted another
ojciec
mother or father to
chciał, żeby
cry,
inny ojciec
because in
płakał.
my
Ja
heart
chciałem
I
zabić
wanted to
w
kill
swoim
so that
sercu,
I and my
żebym ja
wife
nie
would
musiał
stop
cierpieć, żeby moja
suffering.
żona nie musiała cierpieć, żeby się to już skończyło.
I wanted to hurt
Zrobiłbym
other
krzywdę innym
people
ludziom,
to stop
żebym
my
ja nie
own
musiał
suffering.
cierpieć. I zobaczyłem ojca, który ma takie serce święte.
Then
i
I saw the
białe,
father who had a
piękne.
white, holy,
ten
and
ojciec
beautiful heart.
Postanowił
And this
cierpieć,
father chose to suffer
wybrał
so that
cierpieć,
I would not
żebym ja nie
suffer.
musiał cierpieć. To było dla mnie nie do przyjęcia. Nie
It
potrafiłem
was
sobie z
very
tym
difficult
poradzić.
for me to
Uważam, że
embrace
w
and
tym
accept this
momencie to
revelation.
skamieniałe
I think at that
serce, które
moment
miałem
my
od
stony
tylu lat,
heart cracked.
pękło.
Kiedy to wszystko się działo, to było dla niego tak wielkim szokiem, że on na początku nie był w stanie o tym mówić.
All this was
On mi dopiero
shocking to
tak po
Arthur,
po jakimś
and he
czasie
couldn't even
powiedział.
talk about it.
On w ogóle nikomu o tym nie mówił. To było dla niego tak niesamowite przeżycie, że minął dopiero jakiś czas, kiedy on się z tym
It was an
podzielił
incredible
ze
experience for
mną.
him.
Czyli
And he
jak
was able
mocno
to
to
share with me
musiał
only
być,
after some
gdzie mój
time had
mąż gaduła,
passed.
nic
He was
tak
really
go to-
shaken
tak
up,
nim to
and he needed to
wstrząsnęło,
sort
że
it
nie potrafił
out
o
in
tym
his
mówić na
head.
początku. On musiał sobie to wszystko poukładać.
Po tym, co zobaczyłem, pojechałem do kościoła. Podniosłem swoje ręce w górę i powiedziałem, Boże, ja oddaję
After
Ci
having the
swojego syna
visions,
jak
I went to
Abraham,
church,
Izaaka.
lifted up my hands and said, "God, I
Bez
give you
względu
my
na to,
son,
czy on będzie
like
żył,
Abraham
czy
gave
nie,
you Isaac.
ja będę Ci
Do with
służył
him
do
as you
końca życia.
please.
Bez względu
But
na to,
regardless
co
of whether he
powiesz,
will
jak
live or
jaka
not,
będzie twoja
I will
odpowiedź,
serve you
ja
all my
będę Ci
life.
służył. I mam tylko jedną prośbę.
Regardless of your
Jeżeli
answer,
go chcesz
I
zabrać
will
do
serve
domu,
you.
proszę Cię,
I only
żeby to
have
się
one
skończyło
request.
dzisiaj. Jeżeli go chcesz
If
zabrać,
you want to
niech on
take
umrze
him
dzisiaj,
home,
żeby się ten kosmos
please
się
do it
skończył,
today,
żeby
so
moja
that my
żona nie
wife
musiała
does not
cierpieć, żebyśmy
suffer,
mogli zacząć
and so that we
żyć
can
na
start
nowo.
all over.
Jak ja wróciłem do szpitala, to szłem takim korytarzem.
When I returned to the
szpitalu
hospital,
i
the
ludzie
people in the
siedzący w
cafeteria started to
restauracji
point at
zaczęli
me,
mnie
saying,
wytykać palcem.
"Look,
Zobacz, to idzie ten
look,
ojciec
this is
od
the
dziecka
father of the
gwiazdy.
star
To
child."
ten facet, to ten ojciec. Ja nie wiedziałem, co
I
się
didn't
dzieje.
understand what was
Wiedziałem,
happening.
że już pielgrzymki są ludzi.
I didn't
którzy
know that
chodzili do
groups
mojego
of
syna
people were
oglądać
coming to
go.
look at
Ja
my
tego nie
son.
wiedziałem. Kiedy dowiedzieli się lekarze, że ojciec
When the
tego
doctors
dziecka
found out
jest,
that I was back at the hospital, they
poprosili
asked to
mnie do
speak
tego
with
pokoju.
me.
3 lekarzy przyszło. Musisz to zobaczyć.
Three
Musisz z
doctors
nami
told me
iść.
that
Co się
something had
wydarzyło,
happened.
o czym musisz wiedzieć.
They said, "You
Twój
must
syn
come with us.
zaczął
You must
walczyć
see
z całą
this."
aparaturą.
They said to me, "Your son
I z
began
tymi
to fight with
wszystkimi
this entire
przewodami,
medical
które do niego
equipment
odpychały.
and all the
Panicy
tubes that were
wiedzieliśmy,
breathing
co
for
zrobić,
him.
bo nie ma
We
prawa
panicked and did not know what to
ale
do
on
because he
walczy
has
z
no right to
aparaturą, więc na
breathe in his
sekundę, na
condition,
ułamek sekundy
but he's
wyciągnęliśmy
fighting.
rurki
So for a
z
split
jego
second,
przełyku.
we pulled out the
Pamiętaj, że
tubes
nie
from
miał
his
miejsca, do
esophagus
którego
and he
można
began
było
to
się
breathe.
wrócić. Miała jednej żyły
We
wolnej.
began taking
I
X-ray
on zaczął
photos
oddychać.
every hour to see what was
Zaczęliśmy robić co
happening.
godzinę zdjęcia rentgenowskie,
Your
żeby
son
zobaczyć,
is
co się dzieje.
breathing.
Twój syn oddycha.
When they showed me the
Jak pokazywali
photos, they said,
zdjęcia,
"Look,
mówi, zobacz,
in just a
ten
few
płuco,
hours,
serce
his heart returned to its
wróciło,
proper
samo
position
wróciło
and
na
the
miejsce.
lung is growing.
A płuco rozrasta
This is
się.
medically
Jest to
impossible.
medycznie
Your son
niemożliwe.
should not be
Twój
alive,
syn nie powinien
but he
żyć, a
is.
żyje. Twój
Your
syn
son
nie
should not be
powinien
breathing,
oddychać.
but he is." We called a medical symposium and the best experts in the field, and we debated the issue for a whole day. And we came only to one conclusion. Your God has heard your prayers. This is a child that has fallen from the stars. He shouldn't be alive, but he is. He shouldn't be breathing, but he is. We have named your son a child from the stars. Then I understood why the people at the hospital were pointing at me when I returned. The entire hospital was moved by what God had done with my son in Calgary, in the children's hospital.
To było niesamowite. Ja dopiero teraz z perspektywy czasu jestem w stanie widzieć.
This was incredible. I can only now see in hindsight God's plan and what he was preparing for us when I look at our lives and all our experiences, starting with our conversions, through our son's illness, and our later work experiences. Now I'm able to see why all this happened, because now I can see the fruits. But while it was happening, I didn't know why we had to go through certain experiences. I didn't know that my husband would be a preacher and that he would preach with courage. It was then that God was building his character.
A teraz będziemy gimnastykę robić. Aha, chyba zacznę gadać.
Interesuje cię kamera, tak? Tak?
Teraz będzie gimnastyka poranna. Ojej, jaki siłacz jest. Ojej. Jaki siłacz jest.
Bóg więc uzdrowił twojego syna.
God healed your son, and we can say that your life began to change entirely. You became closer to God. Did you return to business? Did you finally start making money? I returned to business, but it was different than before. I said that I wanted to be known among businessmen as someone who does not lie, nor steal, nor bribe.
Zacząłem skupywać ziemię, miałem swoją dzielnicę budować, byłem właścicielem gazety najbardziej.
I began to purchase land. I planned to build my own district. And I was an owner of a very popular newspaper called Calgary Living, then Vancouver Living, and Toronto Living. I had an office in the most prestigious part of town. Polished shoes, nice suits, meetings with politicians, and I ate at the best restaurants. I was returning to life. Things were beginning to work out for me. In 2005, 5 years after God had healed my child, and 5 years after I'd told God that I would serve him all my life, I heard the voice of God again. And he told me this time to pack up my belongings and my photos and to leave my business in my underwear.
W majtkach?
W majtkach.
In your underwear? Yes, this is what he told me. He said to me in English, in your underwear, meaning leaving everything. So I walked out of my office, left everything, and I never returned. My partners stole everything. I lost everything. And when my ego and my brave soul wanted to rise up and fight for what was mine, since I'd earned everything and not stolen it, God said, "What are you doing? Just leave it."
Lata później już był kościół uliczny, już były marsze.
Years later, when the street church was already functioning and we were organizing street marches and great things were happening, I asked God, "Why did you treat me so brutally?" God said, "I had to kill the businessman because that businessman continually fights the preacher whom I wanted to have." In other words, I was divided. You cannot serve two masters, and I wanted a little bit of this and a little bit of that. That is why God had to kill one person, destroy him, shred him to pieces, so that the preacher whom God was creating from scratch could start to serve him.
Tu na poddaszu
Here in the attic is the place where heaven meets the earth.
nasi goście doświadczają Boga.
Our guests experience God in supernatural and amazing ways.
Po raz kolejny na poddaszu.
Today, once more, we're hosting Artur Pawlawski. After God supernaturally healed his terminally ill son, Artur completely devoted himself to Christian service. He now helps the homeless and the needy. He preaches the message of God's love everywhere.
Artur, jak to się stało, że osoba, która...
Artur, how could it be that a person who was once a successful businessman left everything and went to those who were at rock bottom, the homeless, the poor and the needy?
Najbardziej potrzebujących, tych na samym dnie.
Przede wszystkim sam
I really don't know the answer to this question myself, but all I know is that God touched my family in 2000 when He healed my son. This was a breakthrough for me, because in my heart I realized that God had raised my son from the dead. I also realized that up to that moment, I had been living only for my business, my money, and my own ego. I told God that from that point on, I would live for Him. However, it was a process that lasted a few years. Finally, in 2003, an acquaintance came to visit me, and he encouraged me to go to the homeless and to feed them. At that time, Calgary was going through a crisis. The media reported extensively on poverty in the city and encouraged everyone to help, since the crisis was hard to manage. In 2003, for the first time, I decided to see what was going on the streets. My friends and I began to chip in, $2 here, $5 there, whatever we had. We bought pizzas. We invited people, telling them that we would serve pizzas in 15 minutes. They started coming. We shared our testimonies and encouraged them to give their lives to Jesus. This is how it all started. More and more people began to attend our gatherings, and my faith began to be challenged. One day I was wearing a really cool t-shirt with the 10 Commandments written on it, and I was preaching about God's love. I was telling the crowd that God had healed my son and that God loved them. Suddenly, a very drunk, huge Indian man came up to me and said, "Preacher, are you talking about love?" I answered, "Certainly." He then said to me, "Then give me a t-shirt." I was very angry. This was my favorite t-shirt, and I didn't want to give it to him. But the crowd was watching and waiting for my reaction. So I gave him the t-shirt against my own will, and he gave me his. His t-shirt stunk badly and was torn. I preached only for another 30 seconds or so, and I ran away because I couldn't stand the stench. I ran to my car. I will never forget this moment. I ripped the t-shirt off, threw it to the ground, and drove home. I was crying, and I said to God, "God, I don't know how to love these people, but if you want me to minister in the streets, then please give me your eyes, so that when I look at them, I'll be able to see them through your eyes. I want to see them the way you see them, and give me at least some of your love for them, so that I can really love them." When I cried and asked God for His eyes and His heart, God honored my request. I began to see these people differently. I saw little children who, for one reason or another, had ended up on the streets. Something had happened to them. Someone had hurt them. Whether it was their fault or not, now they are where they are. Now only God's love and mercy can change them. This was the beginning of my transformation, which allowed us to do greater things.
Czym tak naprawdę jest Kościół?
What exactly is the street church? You're very engaged and do a lot of great things, but the concept is quite enigmatic.
Pojęcie wciąż może wydawać się bardzo enigmatyczne.
The street church, as the name suggests, is a church. This is a usual church. You mean you have a nice building in the street with nice bells and gold ornaments? Well, this kind of thinking is a problem. We often make a mistake when thinking about church. When we think about church, we often think about a building, but that is not how it is with God. Jesus never asked us to build Him a building, even though He was talking about the church, about the kingdom of God, about His Father's kingdom. We are the church. When we go to the streets, we build a church without a roof, bricks and cement. We build God's church. We often laugh and say that this church has the largest roof in the world, and it can spread throughout the whole earth. We don't have a door through which you can enter and exit. We can enter and exit any time. Our floor sometimes is nicely polished, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes our roof leaks, and sometimes it doesn't. Our church is for everyone who cannot or does not want to go to a regular church, and there are many people like this.
A to nie jest tak, że Wy robicie swoje, karmicie bezdomnych, ktoś tam sobie coś mówi na tym pulpicie.
Perhaps you do your work, feed the homeless and preach, but are there any visible fruits of your
Są
work?
jakieś konkretne owoce tych waszych działań.
Powiem krótko tak. W tej chwili
I will answer briefly. We cannot keep track any longer of how many people have been converted and how many healed. It's impossible to count them. I've been doing this for 9 years, and I can say that every single week someone comes to me to tell about what is going on in their lives. A few days before I left for Poland, a man came to me and said, "You don't remember me, but you baptized me in the river 5 years ago. And I wanted to tell you that I'm free from alcohol and drugs. I have a job and an apartment. I just wanted to tell you this." There are hundreds, if not thousands, of similar stories.
So what you cooking, lady? Wolontariusze, którzy z nami...
Our volunteers consist of former prostitutes, drug addicts, drug dealers, and alcoholics.
Byli narkomani, byli alkoholicy. To są
At some time they were all touched by God, and now they want to give this hope to someone else.
God is a good God. He loves you. He loves you so much that He died on a cross so you can live. He shed His blood, and every drop of that blood was shouting your name. Live, don't die. Live, don't die.
Twoja działalność w Kanadzie.
Your activity in Canada has not been approved by the authorities. Instead of helping you, the state is persecuting you.
Tak nie było na początku.
This was not the case at the beginning. At the beginning, the media wrote positive comments about our activity, stating that the street church was bringing hope. We were well received until the moment when the number of the homeless began to grow. In other words, the government couldn't handle the crisis and keep track of how many people were dying under the bridges. Many of the homeless were gathering at the street church meetings. The food lines were becoming longer and longer. I was told that because of these gatherings and long lines, we made the problem look worse, which in turn made the government look bad.
Masę bezdomnych, władze źle wyglądają.
There was also another problem. The homeless shelters were not doing their job.
Schroniska, które miały pomagać tym ludziom, tego nie robiły. Tam był handel.
The shelters were full of drug dealers, and bad things were happening there. Instead of receiving help, the homeless were abused and their rights were violated. These people began to come to me as a spiritual leader and confided in me. I became their advocate. I started to talk about the malfunctioning of the shelters. I started talking about what was going on behind closed doors. I was defending their rights, and because of this I began to be hated. 2 paid killers were hired to murder me, but they didn't succeed.
Żeby usunąć mnie z ulicy. Nie pomogło.
One of the killers was a man whom I pulled off the streets. He later became a Christian. I helped him find a job. I helped him move, and I bought his first set of tools for work. He came to me and said, "Arthur, how can I kill you? I can't kill you. You've helped me so much." He went to the police and testified. The person who hired him for the job was arrested at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Został aresztowany o 3 nad ranem. Następna osoba po
The other hired killer was still around, and my brother and other folks had to watch my back to make sure that nobody stabbed me. Guns were involved. A lot was going on. After 8 months, the second hired killer was converted.
Ten człowiek się nawrócił.
One morning he came to me and I thought to myself, it's over. I thought that he'd come to kill me, but instead he gave me a hug and told me that he'd just become a Christian.
To wszystko jest zrozumiałe.
All this is understandable because we brought our church to the heart of the ghetto, to the worst part of town, under the bridges. On the one side we had prostitutes, on the other drug dealers. Sometimes there were 50 of them. It was hell on earth.
W ciągu kilku miesięcy ponad 400 osób nawróciło.
Within only 4 months, over 400 drug dealers were converted. There was more to come.
Zaczęła straż miejska się pojawiać.
The police began to show up and tell me that I had no authority to conduct these activities. In particular, after I had declared war on corruption in the homeless shelters, they began to tell me that my activity is against the city law.
Zaczęli oni przyjeżdżać i mówić, nie masz prawa tego robić, nie wolno ci tego robić. Tutaj jest taka ustawa miastowa,
I kept on showing them the constitution that guaranteed these rights, but they insisted that my activities were illegal.
uważali, że nie.
camera.
Weź.
Come on the camera.
Weź.
Come on. Our freedom of rights, the constitution of this country is in violation. Our charter of rights is broken by the law, by the police officer.
Więc ja
I
zacząłem
began to fight and to tell them that the law they were accusing me of violating was without basis. In other words, I told them, you are the criminals. You break the law. Of course, the politicians did not like that, and they began using the media against us. Media reporting claimed that we were doing very bad things, such as feeding the homeless. Who is really disturbed by the street church activities? Corruption and the corrupt politicians. We're dealing with big bucks here. Homelessness is big business that can bring wealth to those who run the homeless shelters and the politicians. It's a mountain of gold. They receive government funding for each homeless person, and right now there are 5,000 permanent homeless on the streets of Calgary, while another 20,000 are occasionally homeless.
za każdą głowę dostają dofinansowanie rządowe.
I mimo tych owoców, które macie, mimo tych niezwykłych rzeczy, które...
Despite the visible results of your work and the fact that many people come off the streets, you don't receive any support from the government. It's shocking.
Wsparcie od państwa. To jest szokujące.
Żadnego.
Not only do we not receive any support, but we are continuously persecuted and attacked by the authorities. Even now, while I'm in Poland, I've received 3 volumes of documents, and I've been called to court for the alleged illegality of organizing church services. When I return to Canada, I'll have to appear before the court for breaking local and city laws. Even though the Constitution guarantees me the freedom of expression, faith and religion, and it secures the right to organize meetings. In our country, we are free to organize peaceful meetings, but the authorities claim that we do not have these rights. I think that their tactic is to exhaust and financially destroy us.
I zniszczyć finansowo. Bo każda taka
Each court case costs us at least $100,000 because we need to defend ourselves. This is what we do. We continually defend ourselves. I've had to appear in different courts over 70 times. I've been arrested 9 times for conducting charitable activities without receiving a penny from the state while pulling people out of the gutter.
Czyli innymi słowy,
In other words, we help the state save millions of dollars, and because of this, we need to continually defend ourselves in courts.
I za to musimy ciągle bronić się w sądach.
Why are you pinpointing that one man when there is a group of people here together? Why?
Jakie formy nacisku stosują władze miasta?
What are they doing to stop you?
To była policja u mnie w domu.
Once the police came to my home.
Stracić moją żonę.
You can imagine, when the police come, they park their cars in front of the building and the neighbors can see it all. They barged into my home and tried to exert pressure on my wife and my children. When I returned home, I found out that the police had been, and my wife was informed that I had received a fine. They could easily have given me the fine while I was allegedly breaking the law. That is, while I was praying for the homeless, because prayer is considered illegal too.
Bezdomnego, bo modlitwa też jest nielegalna. Ja nie mam prawa na zewnątrz modlić się o bezdomnego.
According to the authorities, if I pray for you, I break the law. If I give you a Bible, I break the law. If I tell you Jesus loves you, I break the law.
Właśnie złamałem prawo.
If I give a sandwich to a dying child on the streets of Calgary, I break the law. I am a criminal and can go to jail.
I za to mogę pójść do więzienia. I my o takie prawa walczymy, żeby je zmienić, bo to są złe.
We are fighting to change these laws because they are bad and against the Constitution.
Aresztowania. Na przykład sobie wyobraź nabożeństwo.
Can you imagine a church service where we are surrounded by over 30 fully armed police officers?
Broń, w pistolety otaczających mnie czy tych ludzi, wolontariuszy.
The pressure is enormous. This is psychologically hard for our volunteers, almost too hard to take. Also, for years, my home phone and cell phone have been tapped. They want to know my every move and conversation, who I talk to, how I talk, even where I eat.
Gdzie jadam, praktycznie jestem inwigilowany.
Inwigilowany. Rozumiem, że coś takiego może
I
dziać
understand that something like this could happen in China or North Korea, but how could it happen in Canada? Exactly. This is a problem in Canada. This problem began about 30 years ago when the church began to withdraw from the life of the society. At that time, the church was told not to pray in the street, and they accepted this limitation. In addition, prayer was removed from schools. The Bible was no longer allowed to be publicly distributed.
No nie musimy rozdawać Biblii. Za 10 przykazań zostało usunięte z sądownictwa i tak Kościół się wycofywał i wycofywał i wycofywał.
The Ten Commandments were removed from the judicial system. The church gradually withdrew from society, and Christians were told that the church building and your own home are the only places where you should pray or talk about God, only at home and not on the streets. I'll put it this way. When the light withdraws, what remains? Only darkness remains. This is why Jesus said in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verse 15, "Go, don't sit idly, don't build buildings. Go and preach the gospel to all creation." It is our job to preach about God's justice everywhere. We have this truth, and the devil is afraid of it. I am not afraid to preach the truth, and that is why sometimes I have to pay a high price. However, from a historical perspective, this price is not very high. For example, in China, Christians are killed for what I'm doing, even for less. If you just own a Bible, you can go to prison for 20 or 30 years. In my case, despite the fact that I've been arrested 9 times, each time God gave me victory in courts. I've never been sentenced. We always win because we base our defense on the Constitution. Canada was founded by missionaries on biblical principles. We stand on this truth, and this is why God always gives us victory. I think that God wants a spiritual revolution, and He sent us there for a purpose, to shake up the country a little bit, and to remind them about where they came from. If you forget where you came from, you don't know where you're going. You don't have an identity, and you don't know who you are.
You see, no one guarantees us tomorrow. We don't know if we will wake up tomorrow. We don't know if we will freeze somewhere on the way. We never know if tomorrow will come for us, but what we know is the truth of God, that He loves us. He loves us so much that He sent His only begotten Son that came down and died on the cross for us.
To zadziwiające, że Bóg wysłał.
It is surprising that God sent a Pole to fight for Christian principles in Canada, whereas Poland was also built on Christian principles. What threats are there for us?
My mamy wychodzić i mamy świecić. Jeżeli światłość się wycofuje,
Our job is to go out and shine. When the light recedes, only darkness remains. Therefore, if the politicians try to change our moral standards, we need to object and say no. We can do it publicly. As you may know, I was protesting against homosexuality in front of the presidential palace. As a child of the living God, as a Christian who reads the Bible and doesn't just keep it on the shelf, I say that homosexuality is wrong, because my God says that it's wrong. It's a deviation. It's bad. It's against nature. Abortion is murder of unborn children. In Canada, abortion is legal. You can kill all you want, and the government actually pays for these procedures. They pay for the killing of their own citizens.
Muszę zadać Ci jeszcze jedno pytanie.
I have one more question for you. March for Jesus. How did you come up with this idea?
Wiele lat temu wracaliśmy z żoną z ewangelizacji i przyjeżdżaliśmy do domu przez taką dzielnicę.
One day, many years ago, my wife and I were driving back home. We drove through a street called the Red Mile. A hockey match had just ended, and 15,000 young people in red t-shirts with the name of the hockey team Flames written on them flooded the streets and began to riot, destroy cars and break shop windows. The girls were taking their clothes off. There were drugs and alcohol. At that moment, I heard the voice of God inside of me saying, "Where are my children? Where are the Christians? Where are the people who are not ashamed of me? These people are not ashamed of what they are doing, but where are the churches?"
Tutaj myślę, że był początek właśnie pomysłu, żeby wyjść w takim tłumie na ulicę.
This was the beginning of the idea to organize similar gatherings for thousands of participants wearing red t-shirts to symbolize the blood of the Lamb, the one who paid the price, in order to show the world that you can have fun and be joyful without taking your clothes off, without alcohol, drugs and riots.
I przyjeżdżając do Polski, organizując właśnie z Pawłem Bukałą kościół uliczny w Warszawie,
When I came to Poland and organized the street church with Paweł Bukała, I came to the conclusion that Poland was ready for another revolution, for unity, for another positive undertaking in the heart of Warsaw. Why not? We are the sons of the living God, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords.
Sił ja śpiewać chcę, jak zbawiłeś mnie. Tańcem chwalić będę Cię, wykrzykując imię Twe.
Marsz okazał się sukcesem.
The march was a success. Next year we'll have another one. For sure we will be there. Thank you for participating in our program. See you next time.